Richard Sterling stood at the vast window of his penthouse office, watching the December snow blanket New York City in white. His reflection in the glass showed a man whose wealth could buy anything, except more time. The latest medical report lay crumpled in his fist, its words a death sentence. Aggressive pancreatic cancer, 6 months at best. Behind him, his daughter Catherine's voice trembled with rage. "Dad, this is insane. You can't force me to marry someone I've never met." Richard turned, his steel-grey eyes reflecting the same ruthless determination that had built Sterling Pharmaceuticals into a billion-dollar empire. "Can't I? You seem to forget who controls your trust fund, Catherine, who pays for your luxury apartment, your expensive lifestyle." Catherine Sterling, with her mother's emerald eyes and his own stubborn chin, stood her ground. At 28, she had inherited both her parents' best features and their worst traits, particularly his pride. "This is about Dr. Marcus Chen, isn't it?" she demanded. "Because he rejected your takeover offer for his research facility." Richard's jaw tightened. Marcus Chen, the brilliant young doctor who had dared to refuse his generous offer to buy out his small but promising research center. The same doctor who had the audacity to tell Richard Sterling that medicine shouldn't be about profit margins. "Dr. Chen needs funding," Richard said coldly. "His research facility is on the verge of bankruptcy. A marriage to you would give him access to the resources he needs, and in return, Sterling Pharmaceuticals gets exclusive rights to his research." "And what about James?" Catherine's voice cracked as she mentioned her boyfriend of 3 years. "I love him, Dad. We're planning to get married next spring." Richard's laugh was bitter. "Love? That real estate agent doesn't love you, Catherine. He loves the Sterling name and fortune. Dr. Chen, on the other hand, has proven he can't be bought. That's the kind of man you need. You're dying." "Aren't you?" Catherine's words cut through the air like a knife. When Richard's eyes widened slightly, she continued, "I saw the medical files on your desk last week. That's why you're rushing this, trying to secure Chen's research before—" "Enough!" Richard's fist slammed against his desk. "Yes, I'm dying. All the more reason to ensure both your future and the company's. You will marry Marcus Chen, or I'll cut you off completely. No money, no shares in the company, nothing. You'll see how long James stays around when you're penniless." Catherine's face paled. "You wouldn't. Try me." Richard picked up his phone. "I'm calling Dr. Chen now. The wedding will be on Christmas Eve. That gives you 3 weeks, just enough time for a society wedding that'll boost our stock prices." "I hate you," Catherine whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You're just like when Mom died, controlling everything, everyone, thinking money can solve everything. Well, guess what, Dad? Money didn't save Mom, and it won't save you either." She turned and fled the office, leaving Richard alone with his reflection and the weight of his decisions. He dialed Marcus Chen's number, knowing the young doctor wouldn't refuse, not with his research facility drowning in debt, not with his life's work on the line. As the phone rang, Richard pushed away the memory of his late wife's words. "Your pride will be your downfall, Richard. Remember what matters most before it's too late." But Richard Sterling hadn't built an empire by listening to warnings about pride. He'd built it by taking what he wanted, by making the hard choices others wouldn't make. And if forcing his daughter into marriage was what it took to secure his legacy and possibly save his own life, then that's exactly what he would do. The phone clicked as someone picked up. "Dr. Chen speaking." Richard smiled, the same smile that had closed countless devastating deals. "Marcus, I have a proposition for you, one I don't think you can afford to refuse. A shocking truth about Catherine's forced marriage is about to be revealed. Subscribe now and stay until the end. Your heart won't believe what happens next." Dr. Marcus Chen stared at the marriage contract on his desk. The elegant letterhead of Sterling Pharmaceuticals stark against the worn surface of his second-hand office furniture. Through the thin walls of his research facility, he could hear the hum of aging equipment that desperately needed replacing. "You can't seriously be considering this. Marcus, Dr. Sarah Williams, his research partner of 5 years, paced the small office. Marrying a stranger to save the facility. This isn't you. Marcus ran his fingers through his disheveled black hair, his normally steady surgeon's hands trembling slightly. What choice do I have, Sarah? We're 3 months behind on rent. Our grant applications keep getting rejected, and our current trial results are promising, Sarah interrupted. The preliminary data on your pancreatic cancer treatment shows real potential. We just need more time. Time we don't have, Marcus said quietly, picking up a stack of past due notices. Sterling Pharmaceuticals has been systematically blocking our grant applications. Richard Sterling's made sure we have nowhere else to turn. Sarah stopped pacing, her face softening with concern. So you're just going to give in? Let him win? Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the small courtyard, where he often saw patients from the nearby hospital taking short walks. Just yesterday, he'd watched a young girl helping her father, clearly a cancer patient, take faltering steps in the weak December sunshine. Maybe this is the only way to win, he said finally. With Sterling Pharmaceuticals' resources, we could complete the trials in months instead of years. Think of how many lives we could save. At what cost? Sarah demanded. Your happiness? Your integrity? Before Marcus could respond, his office door opened. Catherine Sterling stood there, her elegant coat dusted with snow, her face a mask of determined dignity despite her red-rimmed eyes. Dr. Chen, she said formally. I believe we should talk before signing our lives away. Marcus gestured for her to enter, noting how Sarah quietly slipped out, closing the door behind her. Catherine Sterling was even more beautiful in person than in the society page photos he'd seen, but there was a strength in her bearing that those glossy images hadn't captured. Ms. Sterling, he began, but she cut him off. Catherine, please. If we're going to be forced into marriage, we might as well be on a first-name basis. She removed her coat, revealing a simple but expensive sweater and pearls. I assume my father made you an offer you couldn't refuse? Something like that. Marcus watched as she examined his modest office, taking in the academic awards on the walls and the piles of research papers on every surface. Though I have to admit, marriage wasn't quite what I expected when he called. Catherine's laugh was bitter. My father specializes in the unexpected, especially when he's desperate. She turned to face him, her green eyes intense. You should know, he's dying. Pancreatic cancer. Marcus felt the irony hit him like a physical blow. That's actually what my research focuses on. A new targeted therapy that could potentially save his life? Catherine's smile was sad. Now you understand why he's really doing this. It's not just about acquiring your research or controlling my life. He's trying to save himself. Marcus sank back into his chair, his mind racing. The preliminary results have been promising, but we're still years away from FDA approval. Even with Sterling Pharmaceuticals' resources, there's no guarantee. There never are guarantees with my father, Catherine interrupted. Only deals and power plays. She approached his desk, picking up the marriage contract. So, Dr. Chen, Marcus, I have a proposition of my own. Marcus raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. I'm listening. We go through with this farce, she said, her voice steady. You get your funding, my father gets his way, and I keep my inheritance. But we do it on our terms. We create a prenuptial agreement that protects both of us, and we set our own rules for this arrangement. What kind of rules? First, this is a business arrangement only. We maintain separate lives, separate residences. Second, we agree on a specific time frame, let's say 1 year. After that, we divorce amicably, and you retain control of your research and facility. Marcus stood, moving to face her. And what about your father? When he discovers this isn't a real marriage, Catherine's eyes flashed. By then, it won't matter. Either your treatment will have saved him, or she left the sentence unfinished. But the implication was clear. Just then, Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Emergency in Lab 3. Equipment failure. Need you now. Marcus felt his heart sink. Another crucial piece of equipment breaking down, another setback they couldn't afford. He looked at Catherine, seeing in her eyes the same trapped feeling he'd been carrying for months. "One condition," he said finally. "We have to at least try to make this look real. Your father's no fool. If he suspects we're faking, he could pull the funding before we complete the trials." Catherine nodded slowly. "Agreed, but I should warn you, I'm in love with someone else. His name is James." And another urgent text from Sarah interrupted them. Marcus grabbed his lab coat. "I have to deal with an emergency." "But Catherine, I understand about James. I'm not looking to fall in love either. I just want to save my research. And maybe, if we're lucky, save some lives in the process." As they hurried down the hallway toward Lab 3, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows. James Matthews, Catherine's boyfriend, his handsome face twisted with anger as he watched his girlfriend rush off with the man who was about to become her husband. In his hand, James clutched a file he'd stolen from Richard Sterling's office, a file that contained information that could destroy both Sterling Pharmaceuticals and Dr. Marcus Chen's reputation forever. All he had to do was decide how to use it. Marcus's secret could change everything. Subscribe to find out the devastating truth in the next part. James Matthews sat in his luxury apartment, paid for with Catherine's money, staring at the contents of the stolen file spread across his marble coffee table. His perfectly manicured hands trembled as he read through the documents for the third time, a cruel smile slowly spreading across his face. The file revealed two explosive secrets. First, detailed records showing that Richard Sterling had deliberately sabotaged several competing research facilities over the years, including Dr. Chen's, using his influence to block their funding and poach their best researchers. But the second secret was even more devastating. Dr. Marcus Chen's mother had been a patient at Sterling Pharmaceuticals' experimental cancer ward 15 years ago, where she had died during a failed drug trial that Richard Sterling had pushed through despite knowing the risks. James picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Mr. Sterling, we need to talk. I have something you might want to see before your daughter's wedding." Across town, in the sterile confines of Lab 3, Marcus and his team worked desperately to salvage their research after the equipment failure. Catherine had stayed, rolling up her expensive sleeves to help, surprising everyone with her capability and determination. "Hand me that petri dish," Marcus instructed, and Catherine complied without hesitation. Their fingers brushed briefly, sending an unexpected jolt through both of them. They locked eyes for a moment before quickly looking away. Sarah watched this interaction with growing concern. "Marcus, can I speak with you privately?" In the hallway, Sarah confronted her friend and colleague. "I know that look, Marcus. Don't even think about it. This is still just an arrangement, remember?" Marcus ran a hand through his hair, exhausted. "I know, Sarah, but she's different than I expected. She's not just some spoiled heiress. She's engaged to someone else," Sarah reminded him sharply. "And more importantly, her father is the reason your mother died." Marcus froze. "What did you say?" Sarah's face paled as she realized her slip. I found the records last year. Your mother was part of the accelerated trial program that Sterling pushed through FDA approval. When the drug proved toxic, Sterling buried the evidence. I was waiting for the right time to tell you." Marcus felt the world spinning. His mother's death had driven him to become a doctor, to dedicate his life to finding better cancer treatments. And all this time, "Does Catherine know?" he managed to ask. "No one knows except the Sterling executives involved," Sarah replied softly. "Marcus, I'm so sorry. I should have told you sooner." Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Richard Sterling. "Emergency board meeting. Your presence required immediately. Concerns have been raised about your research methods." Inside the lab, Catherine was cleaning up when her phone rang. It was James. "Cat, baby, we need to talk." His voice was honey-sweet. "I know how to stop this wedding. I have proof that Sterling Pharmaceuticals has been sabotaging research facilities, including Chen's. We can expose your father, save your inheritance, and be together." Catherine's heart raced. "James, what are you talking about? How did you get this information?" "Does it matter? This is our chance, Kat. Meet me at our usual spot in an hour. I'll show you everything." As Catherine ended the call, she noticed Marcus returning from his conversation with Sarah. His face was ashen, his hands clenched into fists. "Marcus, what's wrong?" He looked at her, and the pain in his eyes made her step back. "Your father," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "There's something you need to know about him. About why I really came to New York to do my research." But before he could continue, both their phones chimed simultaneously. It was a news alert. Breaking: Sterling Pharmaceuticals accused of deadly cover-up. CEO Richard Sterling collapses during emergency board meeting. The attached photo showed Richard Sterling being loaded into an ambulance, his face grey and lifeless. Catherine's phone slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering to the floor. "Dad," she whispered, and without thinking, Marcus pulled her into his arms. She clung to him, forgetting for a moment that this was supposed to be just an arrangement, forgetting about James and his promises, forgetting everything except the comfort of Marcus's steady heartbeat against her cheek. In the hospital waiting room, James Matthews smiled as he watched the news coverage unfold on the television. He'd leaked just enough information to create chaos, but held back the most damaging details, especially about Dr. Chen's mother. Those cards he'd play at just the right moment, ensuring he would emerge from this mess with everything he'd always wanted: control of Sterling Pharmaceuticals. What James didn't know was that Sarah Williams was at that moment forwarding a very interesting email chain to the FBI, one showing that James had been systematically embezzling from Catherine's trust fund for years, using her money to buy inside information about Sterling Pharmaceuticals' competitors. And in Richard Sterling's hospital room, as doctors fought to stabilize him, a young nurse was making a startling discovery. The medical crisis hadn't been caused by his cancer at all, but by a very specific combination of medications. Medications that, according to the hospital records, James Matthews had recently gained authorization to approve on Richard's behalf. The pieces were all in place, but no one yet could see the full picture. As Catherine and Marcus rushed to the hospital, both carrying secrets that could destroy their fragile connection, they were about to discover that sometimes the greatest acts of love come disguised as betrayal, and that truth, like medicine, can both heal and harm, depending on how it's administered. James's true motives are darker than anyone imagined. Hit subscribe now. The next revelation will leave you speechless. The heart monitor's steady beeping filled Richard Sterling's hospital room as Catherine sat beside her father's bed, her hand resting on his. Marcus stood in the doorway, his doctor's mind racing as he reviewed Richard's charts, noticing irregularities that made his blood run cold. "These combinations of medications," he muttered, flipping through the pages. "They're contraindicated. Any first-year medical student would know that." Catherine looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but alert. "What are you saying?" Before Marcus could answer, James burst into the room, his typically perfect appearance slightly disheveled. "Cat, baby, I came as soon as I heard." He moved to embrace her, but Catherine stepped back, something in Marcus's expression making her wary. "James," she said carefully, "how did you get authorization to approve Dad's medications?" James's face flickered for just a moment before his charming smile returned. "Your father gave it to me, sweetheart. He trusts me to handle things when he's not feeling well. You know that." "Actually," Marcus interrupted, his voice cold, "Mr. Sterling explicitly limited medication approval to his primary physician and immediate family. It's right here in his medical directive." He held up a document from the chart. "So, how did you get that authority, Mr. Matthews?" The tension in the room crystallized as James's smile faded. "You're out of line, Dr. Chen. This is a family matter." "Is it?" Sarah Williams appeared in the doorway, accompanied by 2 FBI agents. Because these agents would like to discuss some interesting financial transactions you've been making with Catherine's trust fund money. James's hand moved toward his jacket pocket. But one of the agents stepped forward. "Keep your hands where we can see them, Mr. Matthews." "Catherine," James said, his voice taking on a desperate edge, "don't listen to them. Everything I did was for us. Your father was going to control your entire life, just like he controlled everyone else's. Ask Dr. Chen about his mother. Ask him what your precious father did to her." Catherine turned to Marcus, confusion and hurt warring in her expression. "What is he talking about?" Marcus felt the weight of 15 years of pain and anger pressing against his chest. "My mother was a patient in one of your father's experimental trials. She died because he pushed an unsafe drug through testing. I didn't know when I started my research here, but when I found out..." He took a deep breath. "That's why I refused to sell my facility to Sterling Pharmaceuticals. I couldn't let her death be for nothing." Catherine's hand flew to her mouth, to her. "Oh God, Marcus, I'm so sorry." She turned to James, her voice hardening. "But you knew about this. You were going to use it to hurt Marcus, weren't you? Just like you tried to hurt my father with those medications." "I did it for you," James shouted as the FBI agents moved toward him. "Everything was for you. Sterling Pharmaceuticals should have been ours. The only thing that was mine you wanted was my money," Catherine said quietly. "And you've been stealing that for years, haven't you?" As the agents led a protesting James away, a weak voice from the bed stopped everyone. "Marcus!" Richard Sterling had opened his eyes, his face gaunt but his gaze clear. "I remember her. Your mother, Helen Chen." His voice was barely a whisper. "She begged me to wait, to do more testing, but I was so sure I knew better." A tear rolled down his weathered cheek. "Pride. Always my pride." Marcus felt Catherine's hand slip into his, squeezing gently. The gesture gave him strength to approach the bed of the man who had caused his mother's death. "Mr. Sterling..." "I know I'm dying," Richard interrupted, "but before I go, I need to make this right. The new treatment you're developing, the one that could have saved her, I want Sterling Pharmaceuticals to fund it completely, but under your control. No interference, no conditions." He looked at Catherine. "And no forced marriages." Catherine's breath caught. "Dad, I was wrong," Richard continued, his voice growing weaker. "About everything. The marriage, the control. Your mother always said my pride would be my downfall." He reached for Catherine's hand. "Can you forgive me, sweetheart, both of you?" Before either could answer, Richard's monitors began blaring. His body stiffened as he went into cardiac arrest. Marcus immediately sprang into action, his personal feelings forgotten as his medical training took over. "Code Blue," he shouted, starting chest compressions as the room filled with medical staff. "Catherine, you need to step outside." But Catherine stood her ground. "I'm not leaving either of you." As Marcus fought to save Richard Sterling's life, he was acutely aware of Catherine's presence, of the way their lives had become intertwined through pain and deception, but also through something deeper, something real that had grown despite their best efforts to keep this arrangement purely business. Sarah appeared at Catherine's side, holding a thick file. "Catherine, there's something else you need to see. It's about your mother's death. James didn't find everything in your father's files, but I did. The truth about what really happened that night, it changes everything." In Marcus's research lab, the computer that had been running continuous analyses of his latest trial beeped insistently, its screen displaying results that could save Richard Sterling's life, if they could keep him alive long enough to implement the treatment. Time was running out, secrets were unraveling, and in the chaos of that hospital room, both Catherine and Marcus would have to decide if love really could grow from the ashes of tragedy, and if forgiveness was possible even in the face of unimaginable betrayal. The truth about both mothers will shake you to your core. Subscribe and don't miss the emotional conclusion. The next 24 hours in Manhattan General Hospital became a blur of life-changing moments that would alter everyone's lives forever. As the medical team fought to stabilize Richard Sterling, Sarah pulled Catherine into a quiet consultation room, her hands trembling as she opened the file she'd discovered. Your mother's death wasn't an accident, Sarah said softly, laying out documents on the table. She discovered what Richard had done with Marcus's mother, and she was going to expose everything. Catherine stared at the papers, her mother's elegant handwriting jumping out from old letters and journal entries. The truth hit her like a physical blow. Her mother had been investigating Sterling Pharmaceuticals' unethical trials, planning to bring evidence to the FDA. She died in a car accident the night before she was supposed to meet with federal investigators. All these years, Catherine whispered, Dad said she was driving too fast in the rain, that she was upset about their argument. Her voice broke. He lied. He knew why she was really upset that night. Sarah nodded grimly. Your mother found out about Helen Chen's death and dozens of others. She couldn't live with the knowledge that her husband had prioritized profits over human lives. But there's more. She pulled out another document, this one newer. James knew. He found these records months ago and was using them to manipulate your father, threatening to expose everything unless he got control of the company through you. Meanwhile, in Richard's room, Marcus worked tirelessly with the medical team. His mind raced between the current crisis and the experimental treatment waiting in his lab. If they could just stabilize Richard, there might be a chance. Dr. Chen, one of the nurses called out, his pressure's dropping again. Marcus made a split-second decision. Get me a direct line to my lab, now. While the team continued their work, Marcus spoke rapidly with his research team, giving them precise instructions for preparing his experimental treatment. It was untested, unauthorized, everything he'd fought against in his career, but sometimes he realized you had to break the rules to do what's right. Catherine returned to find Marcus performing another round of chest compressions on her father. Their eyes met across the bed, and in that moment, something profound passed between them, an understanding that went beyond their arranged marriage, beyond the pain of their shared past. Do it, she said, somehow knowing what he was thinking. Whatever experimental treatment you're considering, do it. He deserves the chance to make things right. Hours later, as dawn broke over New York City, Richard Sterling lay stabilized but unconscious, Marcus's experimental treatment coursing through his veins. Catherine sat between her father's bed and Marcus, holding both their hands, forming a chain of reconciliation that would have seemed impossible just days ago. I found your mother's research notes, Marcus said quietly, breaking the long silence. She was brilliant. The approach she proposed for targeting cancer cells, it became the foundation of my current work. Without even knowing it, I've been building on her legacy. Catherine squeezed his hand. Maybe that's why the universe brought us together. Not because of my father's schemes or James's manipulation, but because our mothers were both trying to do what was right. In the waiting room, FBI agents were building their case against James Matthews. The evidence was damning. Years of embezzlement, corporate espionage, and finally, the attempted murder of Richard Sterling through deliberately misconfigured medications. James had wanted everything: the company, the fortune, the power, and in his greed, he had lost it all. As the morning progressed, Richard's vital signs began to strengthen. Marcus's experimental treatment appeared to be working, not just keeping him alive, but actively fighting the cancer cells. When Richard finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was his daughter and Marcus working together at his bedside, their movements synchronized, their concern for him genuine. Helen, Richard whispered, his voice hoarse. I see Helen in you, Marcus, the same determination to do what's right. He reached for Catherine's hand. And you have your mother's heart, her courage to stand up for the truth. Dad, Catherine began, but Richard shook his head. Let me finish while I have the strength. He took a shaky breath. I killed your mother, Catherine. Not directly, but my actions, my pride. I couldn't face what I'd become, what I'd allowed my company to become. When she threatened to expose the truth about Helen Chen and the others, I didn't stop what was set in motion. Tears rolled down his face. The accident wasn't an accident, and I've lived with that knowledge every day since. The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine felt Marcus's arm around her shoulders, supporting her as the full weight of her father's confession sank in. "The company," Richard continued, his voice growing stronger. "It needs to be made right. All of it." He looked at Marcus. "Your treatment, it's working, isn't it? I can feel it." Marcus nodded. "The preliminary response is positive, but it's still experimental. We'll need extensive trials, proper protocols." "You'll have them," Richard interrupted. "I'm transferring majority control of Sterling Pharmaceuticals to both of you. Together, you can rebuild it into what it should have been all along, a company that puts lives before profits." Catherine stared at her father. "Both of us? Your arranged marriage ends today," Richard said. "Whatever happens next between you should be your choice, not my manipulation." He managed a weak smile. "Though I've seen how you look at each other, sometimes the heart finds its way to the right person, even through the wrong paths." Over the next few weeks, as Richard grew stronger under Marcus's revolutionary treatment, Sterling Pharmaceuticals underwent a transformation. Catherine and Marcus worked together to establish the Helen Chen Foundation, dedicated to ethical medical research and supporting families affected by cancer. The truth about the company's past was made public, but so was its commitment to change. James Matthews was convicted of multiple felonies, his true nature exposed to the world. The society pages that had once celebrated his relationship with Catherine now documented his fall from grace. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after their originally planned forced wedding, Catherine found Marcus in his lab, still working late, despite their new positions as co-chairs of Sterling Pharmaceuticals. "Some things never change," she said fondly, watching him peer into a microscope. Marcus looked up, smiling at the woman who had gone from being his arranged bride to his partner in revolutionizing medical research. "Your father's latest scans came back. The cancer's almost completely in remission." "I know," Catherine said, moving closer. "Sarah told me, but that's not why I'm here." She took a deep breath. "That marriage contract we never signed, I had it rewritten." She placed a document on his desk. "No business arrangements this time, no conditions or time limits. Just a question. Will you marry me, Marcus Chen? Not because anyone's forcing us, but because sometimes love finds its way through the darkest paths to exactly where it belongs." Marcus stood, pulling Catherine into his arms. In the background, his computer beeped with more promising trial results, and somewhere in the hospital, Richard Sterling was making plans to make amends for his past. But in that moment, all that mattered was the truth they'd found in each other. "Yes," he whispered against her lips. 1,000 times yes. On the wall of Marcus's lab, beside his framed medical degrees, hung 2 photographs, one of Helen Chen, his mother, smiling in her lab coat, and one of Catherine's mother, both women connected by their courage to stand up for what was right. Their legacy lived on not just in the life-saving research being done at Sterling Pharmaceuticals, but in the love story that had bloomed from the ashes of tragedy. Richard Sterling, watching from the doorway of the lab, felt tears in his eyes. His pride had nearly destroyed everything, but love, real, unforced, unstoppable love, had found a way to heal not just his body, but the broken pieces of all their lives. As snow began to fall outside the lab windows, Marcus and Catherine shared their first kiss as truly free people, no longer bound by arrangements or obligations, but united by choice, by understanding, and by a love that had transformed not just their lives, but an entire legacy. Their mothers would have been proud. And somewhere in the vast history of Sterling Pharmaceuticals, in a dusty file now marked Resolved, lay the story of how pride and power nearly destroyed everything, but love and truth had built something far greater from the ruins. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages, and that healing, whether of the body, the heart, or the soul, often begins with the courage to face the truth and the wisdom to choose love over pride. What would you have done in Catherine's place? Forgive your father or hold on to the pain of the past? And if you were Marcus, could you have found love with someone connected to your mother's death? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit subscribe and like. See that powerful story waiting for you on the left? Trust me, it will move you just as deeply as this one did. Another emotional journey awaits. Your subscription keeps these touching stories coming daily.